Good day, race fans! I'm Unsilent, and we're on the air with the second episode of the Formula One Drive-Thru podcast. The second episode comes to you on the heels of the second round of the 2017 Formula One World Championship. Before we get started, thank you very much for tuning in to the last episode, and hopefully you're tuned into this one as well. So we've got a packed program for you today, so I'm going to keep the intro relatively short because we've got lots to talk about. We have today's Chinese Grand Prix to recap and analyze. We are also going to look at the new engines coming to Formula One in 2021. There was an engine meeting last Friday talking about the direction of the next engine formula, and that looks like it's coming in after the 2020 season. With new engine formula, new engine manufacturers coming to Formula One. Speaking of engines, it's going to be an engine episode. I have a feeling we're going to do an engine episode today. We're going to talk about McLaren's engine plans, not just for next season, but what are they talking about for 2021? And then we're also going to look at Honda's plans. Honda isn't staying pat either. So there's a lot of engine news happening in the last couple of weeks, and we're going to get to all of that. But first, we have to recap today's Chinese Grand Prix, won by Lewis Hamilton. Lewis scored his third career Grand Slam. With this victory at the Chinese Grand Prix, his 54th career victory, but he also scored his 32nd fastest lap, his 63rd pole position on Saturday, and he also led every lap, which gave him his third career Grand Slam. Now, if you're not familiar with the F1 terms, it's Grand Slam is pole, fastest lap, a win, and then leading every lap. And that's your Grand Slam, and that's what Lewis did. Would he have pulled it off if not for some luck on his part? Well, a lot of racing is luck. Don't kid yourself. It's nice to have the fastest car like Lewis does, but you need a little luck to go with that. Sebastian Vettel was 6 seconds behind him in second, and Max Verstappen voted driver of the day, by the way. That's not a big surprise to anyone since Rio Haryanto left the sport, and the Indonesian fans stopped spamming the online poll. Now it's the Dutch fans spamming the online poll. Not that I have a big argument with Max being driver of the day, going from 17th on the grid to third position. We'll talk a bit about Max's climb through the field as we go along. Then it was Daniel Ricciardo, fourth for Red Bull. Fifth was Kimi Räikkönen. Valtteri Bottas, sixth. He had an interesting day. We'll talk about him. Carlos Sainz, want to talk about his race. He was seventh. Kevin Magnussen scoring the first points for Haas Formula One today. So he is in eighth. And then double points for Force India again. Perez leading home Ocon. We had 5 DNFs on the day: Alonso, Kvyat, Van Doorn, Giovinazzi, and Stroll. A couple of those were more spectacular than the others. So I want to start at the start because that's a good place to start. Two people I want to talk about at the start. Max Verstappen going from 17th to 7th in the first lap. Not greatest start off the line, but he managed to bob and weave his way through the field, taking the outside lines. He likes that outside line. We saw it last year in Brazil. Still damp track in Brazil, still damp track in China, and he used the outside line on those long sweeping turns. Nobody was going out there, so he went out there, found some grip, and got by everyone. So fair play to Verstappen. He certainly does seem to know where the grip is in the wet before anyone else. And if he started farther up the field, he definitely would have been right on top of Lewis for the lead at the early stages of the race. Would he have been able to hold on and win the race if he had started, where did Daniel start for this race? He started in P5. If Max had started P5 or P6, he probably would have been right up there with Vettel, maybe past Vettel at the start, I would have to think. But the other interesting starter was that fella down in 11th, Carlos Sainz, who I did want to talk about because he was the only one of the starters that started the race on dry tires. He started on super softs. Everybody else was on the inters, and he was on the super softs. And you'd think on a drying track that would work, and it almost didn't, because if you looked at the replay of the start, he spun. He went wide at turn 1, and he spun coming into turn 2. And then trying to recover, he also clouted the Armco barrier on the inside of turn 2, so it was very close to actually not making it past the start and having this gamble backfire in the most massive way possible. But when everyone had to come in and pit for slick tires, rather, he was able to just all right, you're stationary and I'm still going. And he went through and took a bunch of positions. He was up as high as 5th or 6th at one point, I believe. So he was looking really, really racy there. But we're not surprised. Sainz is one of the more coveted drivers on the pending free agent market in Formula One. Sainz is considered like a favorite to go to. We know he was coveted by Renault, ended up going to Hülkenberg for that seat. And Ferrari might be sniffing around Carlos Sainz to see if they can pick him up to replace Raikkonen if and when he retires, or Vettel jump ship after this season. Also, first lap incidents, Lance Stroll getting punted off by Sergio Perez in the double left-hander there. He was halfway alongside him, so could room have been left for him? Yes and no. It's not a place where you expect to move. Not in the second of those left-handers do you expect anyone to make a move. So I can understand why Stroll wasn't looking in his mirrors, because nobody in their right mind would ever think there's going to be a move there unless it's a video game. On the other hand, Perez was halfway up the side of Stroll. So I can understand why it was a racing incident, but at the same time, I don't know. I think Perez could have afforded to back off a bit. It was halfway through the first lap of, what was it, a 50-some lap race, right? So the Stroll incident led to a virtual safety car. The virtual safety car saw a number of cars come in and pit. On the second lap, you had Vettel, Kvyat, Alonso, Massa, Perez, Magnussen. Well, Perez he had a flat tire from punting off of Stroll. Magnussen, Ocon, Ericsson, Grosjean, Van Dorn, and Giovinazzi. They all pitted, taking advantage of the virtual safety car, and the reason why you pit then is because everybody slowed down, so you're not going to lose as much time being stationary going slow through the pits. It's a good idea, but there's always a but. But the problem was for Vettel, he was the one that was caught out the worst because he had the best chance to win. He was running second at the time. The problem for Vettel was that Giovinazzi went and spun it on the wet tarmac underneath the, I guess it's the media center that hangs over the track there on the starting grid. So he spun on the wet tarmac there, put it into the wall, brought out the proper safety car, which gave everybody who hadn't pitted at that point a free chance to go onto the slicks from the intermediates. So that's why Sebastian was stuck behind Hamilton and Ricciardo and Verstappen and Raikkonen. So if there wasn't that safety car there, could Vettel have challenged? If he hadn't stopped under the virtual safety car, just stopped under the proper safety car, could he have challenged for the win? It's the second race in a row that we've seen foiled pit strategy cause us to miss out on a head-to-head fight between Lewis and Sebastian. Maybe next week at Bahrain, because we don't see a lot of safety cars at Bahrain. We aren't going to see any rain. It'll be interesting because the Ferrari looks like the longer the stint goes, the harder tires, the soft, medium, hards. We've only really seen the softs so far, but I'm just extrapolating out. The Ferrari's faster on the softs over a longer period. So I'm inclined to think that it's advantage for Seb, long straights notwithstanding, because the Mercedes looked pretty good on the long straights compared to, say, Verstappen's Renault-powered engine when we were looking at the head-to-head between those two as Verstappen went to the super softs and started to catch up Lewis setting fastest laps. The question is on tracks that have shorter straights, will the Red Bull be a contender? Will the Ferrari be a contender? Because the Mercedes clearly had, like, the third sector, minimum 0.3 of a second advantage to Lewis over Max. And the third sector is almost entirely the back straight. So it's advantage Mercedes on the power. But we also saw under the DRS, the Ferrari couldn't quite get the Red Bull. All the passes were down at turn 6 where there was no DRS, and that was exciting. The pass Max had on Daniel, the pass that Seb did on Kimi, the pass Seb did on Daniel, quite exciting. They were all down at turn 6. They weren't down at the hairpin at the end of the back straight off of DRS. Now, the midfield cars, they were able to get by under DRS. So I'm wondering if it's the downforce and the drag on those top-end cars. They're running more downforce. So maybe there isn't as much of an advantage from the slipstream from the DRS if you're in one of the faster cars and have a bit more downforce and a bit more drag. That's just me throwing that one out there. I think there's something to that, but it's interesting that DRS was much more effective for the midfield runners than it was for those 6 cars at the front of the pack. Speaking of passing and whatnot, it was nice to see some passing. DRS wasn't huge help, but there was some good passing down at turn 6, as I mentioned. Interesting to see that Ferrari did not move Raikkonen out of the way, because if they moved Raikkonen out of the way instead of leaving Seb behind him for like 15 laps, would Seb have been able to get by Daniel quicker? Would he have been able to take the fight to Verstappen and to Hamilton? That's another big factor, is not unleashing Seb, who was clearly the fastest of those 4, the 2 Red Bulls and the 2 Ferraris that were in that stack there. He was clearly the fastest. If Ferrari had released him by Raikkonen, would he have been able to challenge Hamilton at that point? Some missed opportunities there for Ferrari. Missed opportunities, definitely for Valtteri Bottas. Spun under the safety car. Cost himself a chance. Even with the double stack, he wasn't looking too bad, but he just put himself well back into the pack, into the teens, and had to fight his way back up from the teens because he spun warming his tires under the safety car. We've talked about most of the interesting stories at the start of Grid. We talked about Sainz, who took advantage of starting on super softs. He was the best of the rest. I'm not sure he could have held off any of the other cars that were ahead of him if he hadn't spun in turn 2. Going down the grid, Kevin Magnussen, quiet race, but still came home 8th, ahead of the 2 Force Indias, who are complaining about their cars. Apparently there's an issue where what's being shown in the wind tunnel does not reflect the performance on track. Farther back, Felipe Massa, 14th. The Williams is good in a straight line and is just lacking a little downforce, so they couldn't get the heat in the tires after the safety car period, and Massa just kept falling back and back and back. Fernando Alonso, Stoffel, Van Dorn both retired. Not a huge surprise for the McLaren Hondas. Alonso had a half-shaft go on the left rear, and Van Dorn, they said something on the radio about him having fuel pressure trouble or something to that effect, and they retired the car shortly thereafter. Daniel Kvyat retired. He had a hydraulic failure on the Toro Rosso, and then the last 2 were Giovinazzi, who we talked about, spun out, crashed. Stroll, dead last, got into another crash. Has Lance Stroll crashed today? Yes, he has. Not really his fault. One of those racing deals getting punted off by Sergio. So let's take a look at the World Drivers' standings after 2 races, and it is Vettel and Hamilton perfectly level. Both at 43 points, both with a first and a second. Max Verstappen with his podium, he goes to 3rd, just ahead of Valtteri Bottas. Raikkonen hasn't had a great season so far, but yet he's 5th in driver's standing, so I guess he can't complain too much about that. Going on farther back, Ricciardo, Sainz, Massa, Perez, and Kevin Magnussen with his 8th today goes to 10th in the driver's standings. Over on the constructor side, just 1 point in it for Mercedes so far, pretty evenly matched. It's going to be battle of the second drivers, but the Mercedes is a little bit faster than the Ferrari, or maybe it's just Bottas is a little bit faster than Raikkonen. Based on qualifying, it's pretty close on cars because Ferrari was just a tenth ahead of Bottas, Vettel ahead of Bottas, but not a tenth, it was a thousandth. It was literally 0.001 seconds ahead for Vettel. Kimi was a few tenths back of that, and then everybody trailing in from there. So with that out of the way, let's go to engines. Last Friday, Formula One had FIA and Formula One's managing director of sport, Ross Brawn, had a meeting in Paris with a number of interested engine manufacturers for the next set of engine regulations. Starting about in 2021, they could push it back another year. That wouldn't surprise me. If they start the new engine formula in 2021, it's been around for 7 years, which is a little shorter than the 8 seasons that we had with the V8s and the 3-liter era for 11 seasons. We had the usual visitors at this meeting. Mercedes was there, Renault was there, Ferrari was there, and so was Honda. Few noteworthy people were also there. Reports were that there were at least 8 engine manufacturers there. Cosworth was there. Cosworth also has a V6 solution ready in case anybody wants to buy it from them for this engine formula. Mario Illen was there. He is the man behind Ilmore Engineering, a very prominent engine manufacturer. We are going to talk about them in a minute, and if you remember the rundown earlier on in the episode, you know what this is going to be about. Put it together. Other engine manufacturers showing up. Stefano Domenicali showed up. Stefano now works for Lamborghini. So the Volkswagen Audi group had someone at this meeting, and they've been talking about having engines in Formula One for a while now. They were going to get into this current engine formula when it was still a four-cylinder engine formula. That was in talks for a bit, and then Ferrari vetoed it, and they had the V6s instead. But for a couple of minutes there, it looked like Volkswagen was going to come in with V4s, inline fours, whatever the formula was going to be for Formula One before they decided on the V6 with hers. Also at the meeting, a Japanese manufacturer, according to Autoblid, a German publication. The belief is that it is Toyota who is interested and was at that meeting, but we don't know that for a fact. It makes the most sense because Toyota's been in Formula One before. Toyota has experience with hybrid engines from their Le Mans/WEC program. So it's possible Toyota could be getting in. That's a rumor. We do know that Alfa Romeo was there, independent of Ferrari. Ferrari and Alfa are part of the Fiat Chrysler group, and Alfa had a representative there, independent of Ferrari's representative. And it's possible that Peugeot was also there. There are rumors that Peugeot is looking to get back into Formula One. We'll talk about them in a minute as well. The key takeaways from this meeting: teams want louder engines, but the FIA wants simple, cheap, efficient, and still road relevant. Not all of these things go together and jive real well. You can have your simple engines, and that looks like they're going to do it by getting rid of the MGU-H part of ERS and just go back to the MGU-K or KERS, bigger, more powerful, but not as integral a part of the engine as the whole ERS package is now. It looks like turbo V6s is going to be the way of Formula One in the next engine formula with the KERS, so a little change from what it is now. Are they going to change the engine size? Are they going to change the number of engines they're allowed to have in a season? Because they want the engines to be louder. The engines are limited to 15,000 RPM right now, but they don't run too far past 12,000 because they're worried about fuel flow. You have your maximum of 105 kilograms of fuel at a rate of 100 kilograms per hour at maximum fuel flow, and you have your 4 engines for the whole season rule as well. Sure, a lot could change between now and 2021, but if you want them to be louder, you got to let them turn up the power. So that means either allowing more fuel to go through, because it's the fuel that's turning down the revs. You know, cap them to 16,000 RPM, give them 150 kilos of fuel, on you go, son. Or what if you go like 5 engines, like, you know, you have, like, all right, for every 4 races on the calendar, you get 1 engine, sort of thing. That's where the big change in terms of noise is going to come, is how hard can we run the engines? And right now it's fuel flow, total fuel usage, and reliability concerns that are what's keeping the engines quiet, because they're having to turn them down in order to keep them going the whole way. Everything but fuel efficiency seems to be the concern for this next engine. So, and I guess it's understandable, because like there was the Honda engineer who's leaving the Honda F1 program who said something to the effect of, yeah, this stuff that we're developing for F1 isn't really road relevant. Whereas if you look at the Holy Trinity that they had on Top Gear, the LaFerrari and the McLaren P1 and the Porsche 918, they all had like a KERS system on there as opposed to the full-blown ERS. Even the Toyota Prius has a KERS as opposed to a full-blown ERS. So road relevance is still in KERS, so it's not like they're getting away from it. But F1 is going to be, I guess, moving farther away from Formula E, to say the least. We'll see what direction they go with. And I think another big key to new manufacturer interest is going to be what LMP1 does. We're still waiting to see what the next stage of LMP1 rules is. If there's going to be a lot of costs changing over and adapting to those new rules, could Toyota make that jump? Could Volkswagen make that jump? I guess they're under the Porsche banner, but could one of those LMP1 factory teams make that jump? Possibly. Could someone else new jump in, partnering with Cosworth, partnering with Mario Illen and Ilmore? Well, we saw Ilmore work wonders for Renault. Renault could certainly use him back this season, though. They are noticeably down on power to the Mercedes, but it's not like they're so down on power that they're being picked off as easily as, say, a Honda engine. Speaking of Honda, McLaren has drafted in Mario Illen. I told you I'd come to Mario Illen again. McLaren has drafted in Mario Illen to help them with the current engine woes. Illen recently worked with Red Bull and Renault to help develop the Renault engine for the last couple of seasons, and it brought them back within striking distance of Mercedes and Ferraris. Yeah, Renault's fallen back from that, but they think they're doing fine on their own. Debatable. Presumably, Illen's going to be working in a similar consulting capacity with Honda and McLaren to try and figure out where the problems with the engines are. One of the big problems seems to be vibrations. In between races, we heard that there's a issue with the gearboxes that McLaren is using that's causing vibrations on upshifts, and let's play a little bit of that for you now. That sounds really painful, actually. Engine mappings helped that a little bit, according to Honda, but that gearbox is apparently just not helping them. Publicly, Honda is shouldering the blame, though. They said that when they built a six-cylinder engine out of their single-cylinder test cylinder, it's apparently what all manufacturers do. They build one, see how it runs, and then they build it into a whole engine and see how it works. There are more vibrations and oscillations happening when they put it together in a V6 than what they had with the one cylinder on the dyno. Every bit they add to it, the gearbox, the drive shafts, the tires, is only making the vibrations worse in that engine. So the engine is still shaking itself apart until they take the power back in order to keep the engine from literally shaking itself apart. So publicly, everyone's trying to not blame everyone else, except for Fernando Alonso, who went on the radio today and said that when he was battling Carlos Sainz, yeah, he's a lot faster than me in the straights, but we're faster than him in the corners. The problem is that it's a lot easier to pass someone when you're outbraking them into a corner, and for that you need straight line speed, and not really happening. The McLaren's getting into the point somehow, some way. Fernando strategy, something like that. It's working out well for them. The problem is that they can't finish a race. Or at least, I guess, Stoffel finished the last race, just not particularly well because there was no power in the engine. Now, McLaren is looking for an out. We talked about last week that they are talking to Mercedes, and they were seen talking to some Mercedes engine people this weekend in the paddock in China. Will they jump ship at the end of the season? Who knows? I doubt it. But they're already looking to outs come 2021. There was a report out of Japan that said that Peugeot is interested in returning to F1 with a target of 2021, so right in time for that new engine formula. So you can't dismiss this rumor out of hand. The rumor has Peugeot attached to McLaren, taking over the McLaren engine contract, so that way they aren't stuck with Honda, which is why this rumor is coming out of Japan. Peugeot's been in Formula One before. They've gone as high as fourth with McLaren, actually, in the 1994 World Constructors' Championship. They also had 2/5 with Jordan, and they left the sport in 2000. So they had a short 7-year stint in Formula One. They did have some success with their LMP1 program, their Citroen WRC program, rather. So Peugeot Sport is not exactly a slouch when it comes to developing cars and engines. Granted, you're going to hear Peugeot LMP1 and say, well, they never won Le Mans. Well, they won the WEC in various Le Mans titles how many times? So, it's not like they're a bad team either. Because of the financial crisis, they had to pull money back from the team before they could get into 2012, so they closed up shop, even though they probably still could have done quite well in WEC and perhaps even Le Mans. But if you're looking to come into the sport, an established team like McLaren would be a good place to start. For their part, Honda is not giving up on Formula One. They are actually close to adding a second team to their ranks. Since late last season, we were hearing that Honda was going to work with Sauber, which is why we didn't see Sauber get new Ferrari engines this season, because it would have been a longer-term deal, and they're looking to jump in with Honda starting 2018. That would turn Sauber into something of a Honda junior team. They would get an F1 starting point for the development drivers. Most prominently rumored is F2 driver Nobuharu Matsushita, who would come into Sauber Honda starting 2018. There have been some rumors that its deal could start as soon as this season. Doubtful. Those cars are built around the engines that, they've got now. So it would be a very expensive overhaul for, say, McLaren to repackage itself around a Mercedes, for the Sauber to repackage itself around a Honda. So I doubt that it's going to happen mid-season. The big benefit for Sauber would be that it gets engine subsidy and sponsorship from Honda. There is also some discussion that they could go to Mercedes next season if McLaren doesn't get it. So long as Pascal Wehrlein is still running for the Swiss team, there's a chance that they could get a subsidized Mercedes contract like Manor did. So they would get the best engine on the grid rather than, like now they have, let's face it, the second worst engine on the grid. By the way, the Total Wolff finally said that it's a vertebrae injury to Wehrlein, which has been keeping him out the last few weeks. So we've been kind of waiting on, what the heck's been going on? Yeah, he hurt his neck in that Race of Champions crash, but what's actually going on? Why isn't he in the car? Well, he's got a broken damn neck, so, to borrow the Kurt Angle parlance. There's also a rumor that Honda is looking to buy a team and turn into a works team. Right now they're targeting Force India. How close will they get to that? We don't know. Force India, as far as the Constructors' Championship is concerned, is the number 2 Mercedes team, which would be a good target for Honda, admittedly, and depending on what happens with Dr. Malia, and we talked about his legal woes in the last episode, Force India could be ripe for the picking there for Honda. And we've seen them do this before, where they brought in an engine and then take over a team. They did it in the 2000s with the BAR team. They brought in factory engines for BAR and then proceeded to buy them out. No chance of them doing that with McLaren, but perhaps a Sauber, perhaps a Force India. Perhaps they'll start up their own team altogether. Who knows? The interesting thing to note is that the engine manufacturers have to give the FIA notice of which teams they intend to supply for next season by May 6th. So we're less than a month away from knowing a rough idea of who has which engine contracts in place for 2018. So don't be surprised to see Sauber on the list for Honda. That's why McLaren has been seen talking to Mercedes people, is because these deals need to get done fast if they want to have an engine for next season. But I would expect at least 2 Honda teams next season. That leaves Ferrari with 2 teams, Honda with 2 teams, Renault and Mercedes with 3 teams each. Unless, of course, everything changes between now and the beginning of May. But that engine news will wrap it up for this episode of the Formula One drive-through. A little bit longer than a drive-through penalty, that's for damn sure. Since based on the statistics from the race, a lot of cars drove through the pits. It's about 17.3 seconds to drive through pit lane in Shanghai. This was a little longer than that. But thanks very much for joining me on my continuing journey through Formula One with analysis, rumors, and all the matters in between. Next week, we're going to talk a little bit about the 2018 calendar, and we're going to talk about Mercedes burning oil in their engines. We're going to explain why that's a big deal next week, along with all the news and rumors that happened between now and the end of the Bahrain Grand Prix. So thanks very much for joining me. Like the video if you liked it, subscribe if you're new, share on social media, follow on social media. The social media handle is Unsilent on air. And until the next time, I'm Unsilent. Thanks very much for joining me. Like, share, subscribe, and we will see you next time.